Hello friends, in this video we're going to look at this set of new old stock tubes that I just picked up at an estate sale. Now those of you who know anything about vacuum tubes will know that these prices that are on these boxes are absolutely ridiculous. So the first day I walked into the estate sale, saw these prices, and realized that they had no idea what they were actually worth. The general rule on tubes is that a few types are valuable primarily for use in guitar amplifiers, and a lot of vacuum tubes are essentially worthless, especially specialized tubes that go into tube televisions, which haven't been made since maybe the mid-70s, and nobody cares about CRT televisions at this point except maybe some sort of specialized collector. So this estate sale was doing what a lot of estate sales do, which is full price the first day, 25% off the second day, and then 50% off the third day. So today I went in as the third day and was looking for a bunch of vintage test equipment. I got there an hour late. It turns out I thought it opened at 9 and it opened at 8. So there's a tip: if you go to estate sales, be sure you know what time they open on the third day. But anyway, these tubes were still there. So I wrangled with the guy, looked through the tubes in detail, and finally came up with a price of $70. I pulled out about 4 tubes that I knew were worth that just for the 4, and many others without having going through them. We can generally assume we've got some that are worth $5 or $10, some that are worth essentially nothing. But one of the selling points of these is that they're new old stock tubes. So if you're not familiar with the term, new old stock means that they're brand new except that they might be decades old. So some of these tubes might be 30 or 40 years old, but they've never been used. And basically tubes don't go bad without use. They deteriorate as a function of time, which is really based on the fact that they consume a lot of heat, and the heat deteriorates the tubes. So a tube that's been sitting on the shelf in its original box is just as good as the day it was made. And another thing in the tube world is there was a kind of a quick transition between tubes and transistors in television sets in maybe the mid-70s or so. My family had one that we bought in about 1970 that was almost all tubes, and then 10 years later they were almost all transistors except for the CRT itself. So what that meant was a lot of repairmen had tube stocks on their shelf that really never found a purpose in life, and in this case ultimately ended up in an estate sale. You can tell from the fact that the test equipment that I found there, including a color bar generator, really indicated that these derived from the stock of a TV repairman. And most of these tubes are not of value because they are directed at televisions, but a few of them are either general use that were used in both televisions and audio applications, or are specific audio tubes. Like a good example is, I don't have one handy that I know of right offhand, but I saw one earlier, a rectifier tube. There's a few standard rectifier tubes that are used in tube amplifiers, and those still have value because they can appear in guitar amplifiers and even high-end audio amplifiers for the people that are tube amplifier enthusiasts. So we've got some value here, and we've also got some trash. It's kind of trash and treasure story. Here's one piece that I already found that was kind of interesting. This is the largest box, I think, in the group. It says $20 on it. And when I opened it up, I discovered that the tube is broken. So this tube is worth exactly 0 broken. And aside from for you and me, we can have a little fun examining it. I don't know if I broke this on the way of transporting it or for one of the other people. It says 83, that's upside down. I saw 83 on the box. And I don't know for certain, but just looking at this, I'm guessing that it's a rectifier tube, fairly old and large one. But in any case, aside from you know, an educational prop item, this is trash. So now that you've seen the whole assortment, I'm going to cull through them all separately and pull out some of the better ones to kind of give you an idea of what we have here. One thing I noticed, they seem to have sorted them by brand and maybe by box size. So this kind of intuitive sorting method by brand and box size might make sense if you didn't know anything about tubes. But if you do know something about tubes, you know that what's really important is this tube type number. And that would be the logical way to sort them. The brand doesn't really matter in most cases. There are a few specialized molar tubes that are, you know, of great interest in the audio world. But generally speaking, among these brands of Westinghouse, Sylvania, GE, RCA, Zenith, Sylvania, the manufacturer really doesn't matter within this kind of not quite premium brand category. These really represent all the major tube manufacturers of, you know, the later era of tubes, when the marginal manufacturers had already been sorted out. In fact, you know, I don't even know if Zenith made their own tubes. Sometimes these brand tubes were made by somebody else, like Sylvania. RCA certainly made their own tubes. GE certainly did. Sylvania did. So I don't know about Westinghouse. They may have. But tubes are one of those things that, you know, you need a lot of specialized equipment and volume to manufacture them, so it's not really something that the small brand is going to be able to do. Here's Delco. That was probably made by somebody else. Here's Silvertone, which was Sears store brand. That was made by somebody else. So anyway, I'll look through all these and we'll cull them down and see what we come up with. I've been doing kind of a basic sort here. The first thing to sort on is the first 2 digits here, or 1 digit in the case of some of these, before the letter. So that always means the filament voltage. This is a 12-volt filament. These are 6 volts. So we can just immediately categorize them by filament voltage. 6 and 12 are the common values. There are a lot of less common values that may be more specialized tubes in some cases. 5 is often rectifier tubes. Like I found a 5U4 here somewhere, which made me euphoric. 7C6. A lot of times the numbers that aren't 12, 5, or 6 are of less value, although there's a certain combination of tubes that were used in a line of radios. It's called, I believe, the All-American 5, basically the filament voltages of all the tubes used in the unit add up to the 115 volts that you get out of the line, and that means that you can power the filaments directly from the line. Filaments and tubes are powered by AC, and sometimes that comes off the transformer directly, such as 6 or 12 volt tubes. But in principle, you can also string a bunch of tubes in series to add up to the line voltage, and that was what this All-American 5 lineup was all about. So I may have a combination of tubes here that could be sold as a, oh, here's my 5U4, that could be sold as an All-American 5 set. Some people might want those to replace in a vintage AM radio of some kind. Here's a 12 AT7, which I know is an audio tube that's still used. So the nugget of gold tube is the 12 AX7, which I haven't found any yet, so maybe somebody took those out in advance, or maybe they were just never really used in televisions, I'm not sure. But those appeared in my organ teardown, which more than paid for the cost of the organ just in the 12 AX7 tubes alone. At this point, the collection may look much the same as it did before, but I've done a lot of sorting. First, I sorted things based on filament voltage and then alphabetical after that. And now I've kind of categorized them in different ways. Here we've got the tubes that have some sort of significant value, which I've deemed to be above 10, so 3, 6, $90 there probably or more. That'll pay for my investment on its own. These have small value in the less than $5 range. They may be sold in groups or maybe as a whole lot. We've got some categories that I haven't really evaluated yet. These are 5 volt tubes, 12 volts, and a lot of 6 volt tubes. Over here are kind of miscellaneous voltages. These are odd voltages: 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10, 17, 13, and some other miscellaneous tubes. Those may or may not have some value. I think most of them will end up being in the $1 or $2 range that'll go into some sort of lot. And in this box we've got a group that I learned about. I didn't know about these before this video, but we learned together. These are Compactron tubes, as they're called. So in 1960, GE invented this category of tubes called Compactrons, which provided multiple functions inside of a single tube that were really very much directed at televisions, especially color televisions. In that period, transistors were beginning to become commercially viable and were already available in AM radios. They called them transistor radios at that time, that could be run on a 9-volt battery. But they weren't really that practical for televisions yet, based on performance and maybe even cost. So GE could see the writing on the wall, and they kind of decided to make a set of tubes that could keep their tube business going as long as possible in the television market, which was where the real volume was. The signature feature of these Compactron tubes is they have lots of pins on the bottom. They're usually about this shape, meaning compact electronics. They have this evacuation nipple on the bottom as opposed to the top. So whenever you see a tube that has lots of pins on the bottom and this evacuation piece, then you're dealing with a television tube that probably doesn't have much value. Now, in principle, the application of audio for these things is out there, and they actually may have very good performance as audio tubes. So the way the audio tube market works is they sort of want specific tubes that are in classic guitar amplifier designs, and if you were going to make a new design, you would probably use transistors, or you would adapt one of the classic designs. So in practical terms, you're not going to make a guitar amplifier out of these Compactron tubes, and it's not that that isn't feasible, it's just that it doesn't serve a market need. So if you want sort of ideal lab performance, you could use a transistorized amplifier. If you want the classic vintage sound of guitar amplifiers, you'd use the tubes that were associated with those designs. So that means that aside from a curiosity of maybe building a guitar amplifier out of the Compactron tube, you really don't have a reason to do that. Likewise, nobody wants to fix color televisions, except there may be some sort of niche collector's market for those somewhere. I've never heard of that, but it seems like somebody wants to collect them. One application I can think of is when we visited Elvis's home at Graceland a few years ago. They had some vintage TVs set up in as they were when Elvis lived there in the 70s. And they had like 3 color televisions in the basement running simultaneously. So the Graceland people, if you want some Compactron tubes, give me a call. Now another category we have over here are, these all start with 7 or 14. These are called Loctol. I think they were intended for automotive applications. And the signature feature of these, they have this metal bottom and this kind of locking nub. And you can see the benefit of that for automotive applications where you can lock them in, and they're resistant to vibration in an automotive environment. This particular one says CBS Hytron. Hytron was one of the tube manufacturers. Maybe they got bought by CBS at some point. Those of you who are guitar enthusiasts know that the period where CBS bought Fender is infamous for making bad Fender guitars for a few years. So typically these are of almost no interest to anybody. I've got a big box of them that I just haven't thrown away yet. They might be sold in bulk, I'm not sure, but just from the boxes, seeing 7 volts and 14 volts being of course 2 times 7, that tells us that they're Loctol tubes and they're not of too much interest on the resale market. Down here we've got a whole bunch of 6 volt tubes that I haven't sorted through. As a guess, those are probably worth $1 or $2 each, so they'll probably be sold in lots. Arranging tubes by alphabetical isn't really that logical, except that it helps you find duplicates. So here I've got 2 6J8s. Sometimes if those are used in pairs in typical applications, they can be sold in pairs, and that's kind of desirable. With a tube tester you can verify that they have the same characteristic, although if they're manufactured at the same time, the same manufacturer, like these 2 Zenith tubes, you stand a pretty good chance of them being matched. One of the benefits of organizing these by sort of value is that we can devote test effort to these to the amount that they deserve for their value. In principle, all of these new old stock tubes should work perfectly, but you never know if maybe somebody put a used tube into a sleeve or something. So, these tubes that have some sort of $10 or plus value should all be tested before they go out. These other tubes that we sell in lot, if we just notify that they're untested, that's fair to the buyer, and the buyer will probably assume that almost all of them work. So in a lot, let's say 9 out of 10 of them work. And we don't have to go through the trouble of testing them ourselves. I thought it might be interesting to include a little bit about tube testing. I kind of hope to make a separate video on that one day, so we'll just go through that real quickly here. This is one of the 6 GE5 tubes that might be worth $12 or $20, $25, something like that. So I've got this Accurate Instruments tube tester model 257. I bought this at Hamfest years ago for like $35 or something. The super high-end tube testers still have some value in the $500 range, and in between for sort of less premium testers. This one is low end, but I've had good luck with it, and very happy for my money. So the way this works, it comes with a book that tells you what to set it for each tube. 6 GE5. We'll skip that for now, but it says socket 14. So a lot of times the socket is just obvious from which one it fits into. But we'll check the book anyway. So this has filament D, which we're set on already. So the G setting, whatever that is, might mean grid, is 3. The K setting is 4. The load setting is 30. So I got this plugged in. Turn it on. And with all tubes, you have to let them warm up a little bit to appreciate the glow here. We'll turn my light off. See, it has this nice warm red glow. If you're a tube guy, that's a good feeling every time you see that. So this one, after it warms up, usually takes a minute or less. We can press for quality is this button here, which is kind of the test it button. And this one is clearly in the good range. So this is a lot like battery testers, where if you're anywhere in the good range, you're good. If you're in the questionable range, you're probably bad, and certainly, of course, if you're in the bad range. This one shows 60 on a scale of 100. Now it might be that this is kind of a full-scale value, even though it only reads at 60. We don't really know, except with some sort of experience. And the better tube testers produce numerical values that you can compare against a data book to assure yourself that it's working correctly. So I'll turn this off, which lets the tube cool down. It hasn't been on very long, so I can probably just pull it out directly. Usually rotate a little bit as we pull, which evens out the stress on the pins. So here's its little friend. So we'll turn that on. Hopefully it will begin to glow. If it doesn't, we're pretty much out of luck. Let it go for a while. And sometimes if you don't let it go long enough, it shows bad, but then it kind of migrates towards the good range. So you'll notice that this one also reads 60 on this scale as well. And assuming that these are new tubes, we can reasonably say that 60 is sort of the full strength value. A lot of times the listings for these say tested strong, which is kind of ambiguous, but the fact that 2 new tubes test the same value I would call strong, or in practical terms we're significantly into the good area here. So 60 doesn't really mean anything except just as a kind of a comparative value between 2 tubes of the same type. So here's a 5U4 GB. GB stands for glass bulb. So we know this is a 5-volt tube. I happen to know from the type number of U4 that this is a dual rectifier. So before we turn anything on, we want to match the settings for this in the book. C12, these are in order so it makes it easy. C12 460, 460, and we're socket 9, which I believe is the only socket this will fit into. You'll notice this one is lacking some pins, but that's not a problem. That's the way this tube is designed. It doesn't have too many inputs and outputs as a full wave rectifier tube. So let's see, I match up the key there. Get it a little closer. So as with most things in life, you don't want to force it on anybody. Well, maybe I'm in the wrong spot. Socket 9. Okay, I just didn't get it seated in there well. So since we've already set up all our settings here, I know that we're ready to go. I'm going to turn this on and immediately hit the test button just so you can see it go from bad to good as the tube warms up. So that one actually moved fairly fast. Sometimes they take a while. You can see this one, as it warms up more, it kind of settles in and improves just a hair. And then at some point it reaches a final value. Now, since this is a tube that has two different elements, it's essentially got two diodes in it. There's two listings in the book for 5U4, which is a little confusing. Why would it have two for one tube? But it turns out that's for the two sections. So here we can check the second section by moving K to 6. It's the only parameter that changes here. So K becomes 6. I just turned it off. Turn it back on. Now, tube's warming up. It's literally all about heat, meaning that since this tube is still warm, it'll probably show good immediately. So the fact that it's settled in, so on the numerical scale I read just a hair under 50. I'm a little surprised that the two sections of this aren't identical, but we'll go back to the first one, which was K value of 4. Turn it off. K value of 4. So this section of the tube is a little stronger than the other one, but there's no reason to think that either one of them is bad. They're just slightly different, maybe due to manufacturing tolerance or something. So if you're interested in tubes, buying some sort of inexpensive tube tester like this for, $50 or less is not a waste of money. This has actually met all my needs, but the people that are really serious about selling tubes have a multitude of testers that they try different ones against to kind of get a comparative reading. And also, you can even buy calibrated tube testers. This one is really focused on good and bad and not really about numbers, although it does have a numerical scale on it. And with some legwork, we could probably figure out what the numerical scale means for different types of tubes, but I'm not going to go that far. Now, another thing that came with this is kind of fun. This is a tube substitution handbook. In the old days, you could potentially substitute one tube type for another that were compatible. Sometimes they were two numbers that had virtually the same performance. So that's what this book is all about. I haven't really had a use for that. It's more of a kind of a fun thing to have. This is another tube substitution book. But unless you can find one online, you really need the operating instructions for the tube tester that you're working with, because you know, you would have no idea what to set these things to otherwise. Or maybe you could get one in a PDF form online. But if it doesn't come with at least the operating instructions, you know, that's probably a reason to stay away. They don't tend to get lost with these things because people that have them know that they need them. In fact, this one even, I've forgotten, comes with a supplemental chart, you know. Basically, as new tube models came out, you could still use the tester even though they weren't listed in the book. So I've left this tube on for a few minutes. We can still sell it as a new tube. You know, this is equivalent to sort of factory testing. I just turned that off. Now that it's been on, it's kind of, the heat level on these typically is kind of point where you don't want to touch it for very long. But you know, it's not really that dangerous as far as burning yourself like on a stove or something. So for our purposes, this 5U4GB tube tested just fine, and we can faithfully sell it as a new old stock tested tube for whatever value it'll bring under those conditions. So even though my adventure with these tubes isn't quite complete as far as selling them all, we're going to end this video at this point. I hope you've learned something about tubes and valuing them, at least. We didn't cover how they worked or anything like that, but we did get kind of an overview of tubes from a collector or resale point of view. So we'll end it there. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.